In the last video, we talked about some of the reasons why Macedon was isolated from the south. One of the main reasons involved geography. The main barrier was Mount Olympus, which is the highest mountain in Greece and contains 52 peaks. The tallest peak reaches 10,000 feet, so this was very difficult terrain to pass if you wanted to move from southern Macedonia to central Greece. Mount Olympus served as the border between Thessaly and Macedonia. We also reviewed the kings of Macedon before the time of Philip. Of those kings, two really stand out: Alexander I and Archelaus. Alexander stands out because of his involvement in the Greco-Persian Wars. He was, of course, a vassal to the Persians, but he often switched allegiances depending on who had the upper hand in the Persian Wars. Now, this might have been seen as treacherous on Alexander's part, but in reality, Macedon didn't have a powerful enough army to defend itself against the Persians, or the southern city-states in Greece, so they sort of had to align themselves with the winning side. After the war was over, Macedon broke away from Persia for good, and became more involved with Greek affairs. The country experienced some prosperity under the reign of Archelaus. He was able to greatly increase the treasury by selling timber to the Athenians. He then utilized these funds by improving the infrastructure within Macedon. Eventually, the throne passed to Amyntas III. Amyntas had three sons: Alexander II, Perdiccas, and of course, Philip. His eldest son, Alexander II, was assassinated. Perdiccas then took over as king and attempted to drive the Dardanians out of Macedonia. The bold move ended in total disaster, with 4,000 Macedonians killed. The situation was made even worse as Perdiccas was killed in the battle against the Dardanians. His son Amyntas IV was made king of Macedonia, but Amyntas was only an infant, so Philip was appointed as his regent. Philip promptly claimed the throne for himself in 359 BC. Now, under ordinary circumstances, this might not have happened, but these were not ordinary times. Macedon faced dangers from every direction, so a strong, capable leader was needed, and Philip was clearly ready to handle the immense task of saving Macedonia from utter destruction. Now, previously, Philip had spent 3 years in Thebes as a hostage. Here he received an excellent military and diplomatic education from Epaminondas. Epaminondas undoubtedly had an enormous influence on Philip's career. As I mentioned before, Philip faced immediate dangers as he assumed the throne. First and foremost, there were foreign invasions that threatened to sweep away Philip's kingdom. Justin states that, quote, the Macedonians had perpetual contests with the Thracians and Illyrians, end quote. These threats had to be dealt with. The problem was that the Macedonian army was, for all intents and purposes, non-existent, especially after the defeat in 359 BC. Therefore, initially, Philip needed to solve these issues through diplomacy. So Philip simply bribed the Thracians to withdraw their armies. But the Dardanians were still a constant threat as they occupied Upper Macedonia. Philip could not afford to fight the Dardanians, as he needed more time to consolidate his throne and rebuild his army. He wisely sealed an alliance with the Dardanians by marrying the great-granddaughter of Bardillus. Bardillus was the king of the Dardanians. The royal marriage prevented an immediate invasion by the Dardanians and bought Philip the precious time that he needed to rebuild his kingdom. After temporarily halting the foreign expansions into his territory, Philip now needed to deal with rival claimants to his throne. The most serious was Argeus, who convinced the Athenians to support his claim to the Macedonian kingdom. The Athenians dispatched a fleet with 3,000 hoplites to assist Argeus. The Athenians and Argeus decided to march against Amphipolis. However, Argeus failed to rouse any serious support from the Macedonian population. Therefore, he decided to retreat back to Athens' main base at Methone. During the retreat, Philip was able to intercept and destroy Argeus' force. In order to maintain friendly relations with Athens, Philip returned the captured Athenians without harming them in any way. Although this battle is just a small footnote in history, it boosted the morale of the Macedonian army. Diodorus writes, quote, now Philip, by his success in this first battle, encouraged the Macedonians to meet the succeeding contests with greater temerity, end quote. With his borders and throne secure, Philip now set about the task of reorganizing his army in 359 and 358 BC. The reforms he instituted would make the Macedonian army the envy of the ancient world. Philip, of course, was a man of war. He wanted to make Macedon the greatest power in Greece. Philip's ascension to the throne represented a changing of the guard in Greece, as the Macedonians were about to go on a rampage that would rock the ancient world. Justin writes, quote, "The name of the Macedonians, previously mean and obscure, rose into notice, and Philip, who had been kept 3 years as a hostage at Thebes, and had been imbued with the virtues of Epaminondas, imposed the power of Macedonia, like a yoke of bondage, upon the necks of Greece and Asia." End quote. Now, I do want to point out that there were numerous great generals in the history of Greece before Philip's illustrious career. Let me just mention a few of these commanders that we have covered throughout this series. You will remember Miltiades' unconventional tactic of deliberately weakening the center formation and strengthening the wings. This worked in the face of a Persian army that was several times larger than his own army. The Peloponnesian War also produced several great generals, of which Brasidas and Demosthenes stand out. You will remember that Brasidas captured Amphipolis, and Demosthenes changed the course of the Peloponnesian War with his bold capture of Pylos. Xenophon's skillful command of the rear guard, deep in the heart of the Persian Empire, also stands out. If not for his brilliant tactics, the 10,000 might never have made it out of Persia alive. And then, of course, there is Epaminondas, who is held in the highest esteem by historians from both antiquity and modern times. His overloading of the left flank destroyed the Spartan wing at the Battle of Leuctra, and forever altered Sparta's ambitions for complete domination of Greece. Also, we should not forget Iphicrates' innovations to the light infantry, which gave the Spartans all kinds of problems during the Corinthian War. Philip would have studied all of their tactics and maneuvers. He had a particular genius for understanding what worked and what did not, and then incorporating the working elements into his own army. But what is perhaps more amazing than anything is how fast Philip reformed his army. Diodorus writes, quote, "Philip was not panic-stricken by the magnitude of the expected perils, but bringing together the Macedonians in a series of assemblies, and exhorting them with eloquent speeches to be men, he built up their morale, and having improved the organization of his forces and equipped the men suitably with weapons of war, he held constant maneuvers of the men under arms and competitive drills. Indeed, he devised the compact order and the equipment of the phalanx, imitating the close order fighting with overlapping shields of the warriors at Troy, and was the first to organize the Macedonians' phalanx." End quote. Philip realized that in order to conquer Greece, he was going to have to develop an unbeatable fighting force. First, he made the Macedonian army a year-round professional army. So now the military became a full-time occupation for each soldier. And the important part here is that this would be a standing army, an army that was maintained in a constant state of readiness, prepared for any new campaign or threat that might arise. Also, these soldiers would be paid. Now, it's important to note that although Macedonian soldiers were paid, they were not mercenaries in the true sense of the word. They were loyal first and foremost to Macedonia. I think in many respects one can compare the Macedonian army to modern forces like the US, Russia, Britain, and France. These soldiers are paid, but they are loyal to the country they serve. So let's take a look at the Macedonian battle formation. The first three units we are concerned with are the heavy infantry, the elite heavy infantry, and the heavy cavalry. There were many other units that had all sorts of functions, and we will discuss these in later lectures. First, let's take a look at the main part of the phalanx, which was composed of the heavy infantry. The cavalry in Macedonia had always been quite good. The problem was the infantry. It was the weakest part. It was here that Philip knew he would first have to reform, especially if his phalanx was going to stand up against the hoplite formations from the cities in southern Greece. Philip's most important innovation by far was the introduction of the sarissa, an exceedingly long spear. This gave his infantry a decided length advantage over other phalanxes of the day, which primarily used the dory. The dory was about 2 to 2.5 meters long, or 7 to 9 feet in length, while the sarissa was 4 to 6 meters, or 13 to 20 feet in length. The sheer size of the spear required soldiers to wield it with both hands. Therefore, the infantry needed to wear a smaller shield that was usually suspended from the neck. The sarissa's great length was a huge asset against rival hoplites. Opposing infantry needed to clear the entire length of the spear before they could even engage the Macedonians. Often the Macedonians mowed down opponents almost like a tank. These spears were wielded by the heavy infantry, which occupied the center. So the entire goal of the Macedonian phalanx was to keep all of their enemies at a distance, which gave the Macedonians an almost unbeatable edge in warfare. In case fighting moved to close quarters, the heavy infantry also maintained a secondary weapon. The Macedonian phalanx was so effective, it could even withstand and even break up a frontal assault from enemy cavalry. The other major unit we are going to examine are the Hypaspes, or shield-bearing guards. These were considered the elite heavy infantry. This unit was likely armed with the dory spear rather than the longer sarissa. The Hypaspes were positioned on the flanks of the heavy infantry. This gave the heavy infantry formation a great deal of protection, especially since the sarissas made it cumbersome for the formation to turn quickly. In turn, the Hypaspes flanks were protected by the light infantry and cavalry. The added protection made it difficult for any enemy to launch side attacks, because side attacks were considered the weak spot of the Greek phalanx. And once again, the Hypaspes allowed the main body of heavy infantry to concentrate their attack from the front, where they were practically invulnerable. It should be noted that there is quite a bit of disagreement about the Hypaspes in terms of their exact role and equipment. Nonetheless, everyone agrees they were a vital unit in Philip's army. Finally, we will talk about the companion cavalry. The companions rode the finest horses and received the best equipment. The companion cavalry units consisted mainly of upper-class citizens who could afford the expensive horses and armor required for the unit. The cavalry were usually organized into 8 squadrons, and each squadron contained about 300 horses. The companion cavalry usually attacked in a wedge formation, and are considered by many to be the first shock cavalry units in history. Later on, Alexander himself led the companion cavalry's charge, and often used it as the decisive blow against an enemy formation. The companions usually occupied the far right wing of the Macedonian formation, and were situated to the right of the Hypaspes. So, in a remarkably short period of time, Philip had created one of the finest military machines in the ancient world. By 358, Philip and his re-energized army were ready to move. Philip was absolutely determined to remove the most serious threat to Macedon, the Dardanians, and he wanted this menace removed for good, especially since the Dardanians had been expanding for nearly 5 decades. Now, if you take a look at this map, you can see the location of Dardania. The place that the Dardanians pushed into was an area referred to as Upper Macedonia. Upper Macedonia was a very rugged mountainous area in comparison to Lower Macedonia. The problem for Philip was that Upper Macedonia acted as a natural defense boundary against foreign invasions. As long as the Dardanians occupied this area, they would pose a constant threat to Philip. And so, as I mentioned before, Philip was determined to reclaim this part of Macedonia. Bardyllis learned of Philip's intentions and offered to sign a new treaty which would have essentially maintained the existing borders. Philip rejected this outright, stating that the Dardanian army needed to withdraw from Upper Macedonia. Bardyllis quickly refused, not wanting to give up his winnings, and so both sides prepared for war. The Macedonians and Dardanians were evenly matched. Philip's manpower numbered at 10,000 infantry and 600 cavalry, while the Dardanians checked in at 10,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. The Dardanians formed into a linear formation with cavalry on both flanks. Probably their best soldiers were located in the center. Philip likely arranged his army with his heavy infantry in the left and center, and the cavalry on the wings. Philip occupied the usual position of honor on the right, where he placed his best troops. He was likely in command of his elite troops, the Hypaspes, who occupied the right flank. Philip wanted the heavy infantry to tie up the Dardanian center, while his Hypaspes would crash into the enemy's left flank. And with that, the horn sounded, and both armies advanced toward each other. A ferocious fight ensued. The battle hung in the balance as neither side made much headway. However, slowly but surely, Philip and his elite troops made progress, striking deep into the Dardanian left flank. The Dardanian left flank was pushed back, and under the immense pressure had no choice but to yield ground. The companion cavalry was also successful on the right flank, routing the Dardanian cavalry. After that, the companions ripped into the left flank of the Dardanian formation. The Dardanian left flank quickly lost heart and fled the battlefield. The rest of the Dardanian army soon followed in sheer terror. The victory was complete for Philip. The Dardanians lost more than half of their army on that fateful day. 5,000 dead with another 1,000 captured. The Macedonians lost just 300 to 500 soldiers. Philip's victory succeeded in removing the Dardanian threat for good. He also recovered all of the cities that had been occupied in Upper Macedonia. Even more importantly, he was able to change the situation in the western borders in favor of Macedonia. Philip secured Macedonia's frontier by annexing Illyrian territory as far as Lake Ohrid. This was located in an extensive mountain range that would once again provide a natural barrier between Illyria and Macedon, a sort of defensive buffer against any future raids. Philip, however, was not even remotely finished with his overall plan. He was now prepared to consolidate more territory in northern Greece, and we will get to that in the next video.